right, Carlton King is a former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy Podcast, the show that shines a light on the hitherto hidden world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations, and gives you, the viewer, the chance of seeing and understanding the geopolitical connections between this world and your everyday life. Obviously, the great news of this particular week is the invasion by Russian soldiers of the Ukraine. Now, I have been asked by countless people, journalists, people who just want to know, people in intelligence, what my thoughts are on the actions of President Putin. I was asked this before he invaded, and I've been asked since. So what do I think about why Putin has done what he's done? Now, what I always try to do in the show is not just give you one view, the view which you can find on wall-to-wall TV every night, just turn it on, you're going to hear how Russia's invaded and it's all down to Putin, the bad guy, and he's done it because he's mad. I want to give you a different view, not a view that in any way, shape or means takes away the culpability of Putin. But what it does do is give people hopefully an understanding from the perspective of Russians, I can't say every Russian, but let's say most or indeed some, why one would think that President Putin has taken the actions that he's taken, and the perspective maybe of the Ukraine as to why they're doing what they're doing. One element is obvious. You've invaded my land, so I want to defend it. So that's one obvious aspect. But that would then not take account of the nuances of the country, which is the Ukraine. So what I want to do is, in trying to bring this to the fore, is to go back in history. Because nothing, and believe me, I do mean nothing, starts today. There's always a precursor to it. There's always something that happened before. And in my time in the world of intelligence, be it national security or secret intelligence, what I tried to do was, and what I thought made me a better officer in both veins of that work, and indeed even in personal governmental protection operations work, I tried to understand what the enemy or the person whom you're working against thinks and how they think and why they do it. This is particularly important when you're an intelligence officer and you're trying to recruit the enemy, be they in a terrorist organisation, be they from a different country, be they even in a cult or something that you need to get an ear on because, like the cult at the turn of the century, is dangerous and is actually doing things which you would think only nation states would do. So it's always important to understand the other person's view of what you think and where you are today. So that's the first thing. In the terms of national security, you need to understand that because you need to try and figure out what are they going to do? What are their intelligence officers going to do? Are they going to try sabotage? Are they going to try subversion? What would they do to destabilise your state? And what are your actions to prevent that destabilisation or to catch them in the act of doing that destabilisation by understanding where they are? And also, as a national security officer, you also want to recruit intelligence sources agents, as we call them, that can provide you with information as to what the enemy might do. And then, as I said to you before, also in the terms of personal protection. You're with a government minister, you're in a different country. Who is the person who might try to attack that minister? Or indeed, you've got the President of the United States and you're in the United Kingdom. What are the groups which may want to undermine and destroy or attack the President of the United States, or the President of Russia, or the President of Angola, or the Chancellor of Germany, whomever you're protecting? What would be the groups that would be against them? So for all of those reasons, you need to understand what is that country, in the eyes of others, done wrong, which will cause the individuals who want to assassinate that leader to do that, and what are the reasons behind it. So I've basically spent my whole career trying to understand the other person's perspective, because I think that's what makes you the best officer in this secret world. Luckily, I've had quite a bit to do in my time with Russia, and had to understand it on many different occasions, from the Cold War, when I was looking at left-wing subversive organisations, etc., intelligence officers from the Warsaw Pact, and after the Cold War, what made some states function, who was running those states, when the communists were no longer in power, what happened to them and what would they do, etc. And also, I guess, looking at it in that kind of depth and that understanding, I also wanted to understand why we looked at Russia as the enemy in those days, the Soviet Union, which is pretty much obvious why in those days, but subsequently, after the fall of the Soviet Union, why were we still looking at Russia? Especially when Russia in the early 90s was a basket case and had very little to offer in terms of attacking the West, and indeed appeared to be looking towards the West in those days. So again, it's understanding the bigger circle. So let's go back, because I think I'm going to start with the Russian Empire. I think I'm going to start, this is before communism, before the USSR. I'm going to start with the fact that, as I understood it, the Russian state, when it was Russia, the Russian Empire, way back 200 years ago, had taken Kiev and had that as part of Russia. The other part, which is in what we now would call the western areas, I guess Kiev is also in that, but the more further western areas were part of either Poland or part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So for ever and a day, you could argue what is now the Ukraine has been squeezed between kind of major powers, Austro-Hungarian Empire and Russia, Poland when it was recreated. And so there was only a short period when Yugoslavia was free, because it's the same Austro-Hungarian aspect, and the Ukraine was free. So these two small periods for these both countries, and the reason why I mention Yugoslavia is because it also went into warfare, because of the different peoples within that state, as you have got different peoples in the Ukraine, or in one state. And this is how things become uneasy and unmanageable sometimes, when there's more than one identity in a particular state. So let's jump forward then to 1917, and we come to the Russian Revolution. Then 1921, and you get the forming of the Soviets after the war. Now, what I should say is I shouldn't jump that far. After the First World War and the Germans were defeated, and the Russian Empire had ended in 1917 because of the storming of the Winter Palace and those aspects that was bringing communism into play. Directly after that, into 1919, what had happened is that the West saw a danger in what was the Soviet Union, and the fact that the workers had risen up against the ruling elite. And so what happened is the West, the United Kingdom, surprisingly in some ways America, and I say surprisingly because although America was clearly a capitalist state, it really didn't often want to get involved in European matters, but it did. So that's what you had. You had the UK, British Empire, elements of the French Empire. You had people from another 18 different states, including Japan and others, who all came together and basically invaded what was the Soviet Union then, or the beginnings of the Soviet Union, to try and keep the white Russians, which is what they call the capitalist Russians, in power, and thereby to overthrow communism and get rid of it. So right at the birth of communism, and by the way, the 19 states that were involved included Germans who'd been fighting the West in the German army. And if you recall, the Russian Empire was on the side of the West at that time to try and prevent the German Empire from winning. But they took those Germans from the German army and they all invaded Russia to try and bring the White Russians and put them back into power. Suffice to say, the West got beat and that army of many different states fell apart, and the Soviet Union was able to keep itself as a particular body. Now, I mention this point because this is the beginning, if nothing else, of the disbelief in the Soviet Union and those communists of the time about the West and what it would do in order to overthrow it and undermine it. So from day one, as they perceived it, the West was, in the eyes of the Soviet people, the USSR, so that's Russia and the 15 other Soviets that made up the Soviet Union, Russia being the biggest, but only one, Ukraine being another, Kazakhstan, Belarus. I could go through all the 15 Soviets, but that would be pointless right now because it's a time factor we're going to have to work to. But needless to say, you can look at what was the Soviet Union, and all of those states basically came together as one under communist control. Now, they didn't just put their hands up and say we're all part of communism. No, some were believers, some were not. Many, many people died. Many millions indeed died in fighting that war in order to make the Soviet Union. And there were diehard people on both sides, and atrocities were carried out on both sides, as is the case in war, particularly in civil wars. So what you've now got is this Soviet Union, and then, of course, we get the movement then from that to try and secure itself to make sure that it can still function. So we run up now to into the Second World War from the first. And basically, the Soviet Union had a good spy system, very, very good spy system, the Rotakapelle, who were spies all over Europe, and indeed in the United States as well, and began to understand what other states were trying to do, and therefore, and I don't understand why he didn't take any action, Stalin knew that even though Germany, Nazi Germany, had made its actions against the West, and, well, let's rephrase that actually, it was trying to get room in the East by taking Czechoslovakia. It took back areas in the West, but only areas that you would call German areas, or they perceived to be German areas before the First World War. But it's really pushing room was in the East, so in Czechoslovakia and into Poland. That was its first attempt to go forward. Now, Britain and France could not allow that to happen because, of course, what they knew was that if Germany got so powerful that it actually pushed eastward and it indeed went into the Soviet Union and defeated it, it would be so powerful a country that it would undermine France and Great Britain. So what happened is France and Great Britain put forward ultimatums in unison, and when, of course, Germany invaded Poland, took over the whole of Czechoslovakia after it took over the Sudetenland first, but then took over the whole of Czechoslovakia, and then started to invade Poland, then Britain and France declared war on Germany. Now, understand what I said. Britain and France declared war on Germany. Germany did not declare war on Britain and France. It was the other way around. Now, before that took place, what had happened is that the Soviets had put out feelers to try and get Britain and France to come with them in order to have some defence against Nazi Germany. They didn't. And the reasoning, I understand why, was that for some aspirants of empire, both the British and the French Empire, it was preferable that Germany and the Soviet Union bleed each other out. So fight a war against each other and they both end up killing each other. And that would then make it easy for the UK and France to continue as they were major players around the world with big empires. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. unfortunately, because of the declaration, Hitler first made his attack into the West. And as you know, its history, Belgium fell, then Germany was able to take over France, and France fell, the Netherlands, etc., etc., etc. And the only country that stood that it couldn't take with its empire, Britain did not stand alone, Britain empire stood there, and then Britain's empire was the greatest the world had ever seen. And one has to understand what that means, is that was a third of mankind. I use the word mankind because that's the sort of terminology they would use in those days. But a third of all the world's population were under British rule. And therefore, when Britain was at war, they were all at war. So what you had was a massive resource for Britain to fight its war using the empire, which was a third of the world's population and indeed a third of the world's landmass. Greatest empire the world has ever seen. So when Britain then was able to push away the Germans in the Battle of Britain, first thing, they couldn't control the skies. What then happened was that Hitler, with all his armies amassed, thought, I've got to go for the Soviet Union. Why, I don't know. He obviously knew, and his generals were saying to him, fighting a war on two fronts is crazy. I guess he thought he could sit the UK in some sort of limbo and leave it there while he destroyed the Soviet Union, and then come back to the UK, maybe even for peace talks, saying, listen, I've destroyed the Soviet Union, you will be next if you so wish to put it that way. So I don't want to second guess what Nazi Germany is thinking. There's enough books written about it, and you can think about what you would think. But the bottom line is that in 1941 then, Hitler attacks the Soviet Union, called Operation Barbarossa. And even though Stalin had a lot of information to say that was going to happen, for whatever reason, he did not defend his area properly. This is the problem with Stalin. Some think he was a madman, and he may well have been so, or a fellow who feared more internal problems than he did external problems in the first instance. But he saw then how Germany rolled into Ukraine. And in the Ukraine, because they were members of the Ukraine and realised that at one stage they were, be it 500 years ago, be it just a few years in the 20th century, were free, some of those people, when Hitler rolled in, were happy to be on the side of the Germans. And indeed, there was the Galician SS, was a section of the SS that was a Ukrainian section, and various other bodies as auxiliary police for the Germans. Now, the problem is that these units were absolutely vicious in attacking Soviet, communist, Romani, Gypsies, Jewish, whatever the German laws were, there was no quarter cut, exterminating them, along with the Germans. So the folklore then was that a section of the Ukrainian populace could not be trusted. Now, let's get this in context. This was by no means all of the Ukrainian people. Number one, part of the Ukraine, the eastern Ukraine, had been ceded by Russians for many, many years, in fact centuries. So there were Russian speakers in parts of the east of Ukraine anyway. Plus also, other Ukrainians were communists and happy to be communists, and therefore fought absolutely rigorously on the side of the Soviet Union to defeat the Nazis. But, and this is the big but, when the Soviets finally defeated the Nazis and bled out the Germans, which was the real thing, because one needs to understand the 7 million Germans who lost their life in the Second World War, soldiers I'm talking about now, around about 6 million of them were on the Eastern Front. So it wasn't fighting us in the West where most of the soldiers lost their lives and most of the equipment was destroyed and most of the war went on. It was in the East. It was a full war of attrition, a war of extermination. And of course, the Soviets lost, who knows? Some people say 28 million, others say 40 million. The figure is unbelievable. We don't know what the figure is. Take into account that we lost 500,000 people. The United Kingdom, that is. The Americans lost 500,000 people. Other forces which are attached to the United Kingdom, so part of our imperial forces, let's say forces like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, most of those forces lost less. I won't go through the figures, but less than 30,000 people each state. Some of them, like Canada, lost more, I think 50,000. Australia lost around 25, and New Zealand about 11,000. So these are the losses. Indeed, if you want to take about the British Empire, and the largest losses of people in the British Empire were the Indians. The Indians lost about 3 million people fighting on the side of Britain. So we need to understand that, but that's another story. So let's look at where we are. We've got a Soviet Union which fought, died en masse. I mean, we talk about the Second World War all the time in this country, and we lost, as I said, 500,000 people, including all the civilians, all the way through the Blitz, everything. You can put them all together. We've lost 500,000 people, including, by the way, those countries that are not standalone, like Dominion countries I just mentioned, like Australia, Canada, British India. Those countries, like my father, for example, fighting for Great Britain, the West Indians or the Africans who fought for Great Britain, those are included in that loss of 500,000. So you can see, we talk about the war with a loss of 500,000. What if we had lost 28 million? How would we think about it? And that's the minimum that the Soviets lost, okay? So the war, Second World War, takes up a massive aspect and belief of their life. Take into account that at the end of that war, what happened was that the people who'd fought for the Germans, some of them were sent back under the Yalta Agreement to the Soviet Union and were going to be dealt with harshly, i.e. executed. But because the Cold War had already begun, many of them found partners here in Britain and in the United States and in Canada where they could go to. So even though they'd been in the Galician SS, they were actually brought to Britain and lived in Britain, and their children lived in Britain and were brought up. Now, this is important because part of the Russian perspective, when you hear him say Nazi aspects, Putin say that, he's talking about the sons and daughters of these Galician SS and others who were fighting against the Soviet Union. So that's his perspective. Right, so we've got an understanding now of the Second World War. We've got an understanding what it meant to the Soviet Union. And of that 28, it's said that Russia lost about 20 million of the 28 million. If you just take one Soviet by itself, Belarus lost about half its population. And Ukraine obviously lost a massive number of its population as well, a couple of millions in that conflict. So if you want to take the various Soviets like that, you can bring them down and see how many were lost from various areas. So taking all this into account, what you have to see then is the mistrust of the Soviet Union towards the West in general. Now, let's jump forward to the end of the Cold War, and I'm jumping forward because it's timings that we've got to look at. At the end of the Cold War, when, frankly, the Soviet Union could no longer compete with Western capitalism, because I think it's important because we want to answer some of the questions that Putin keeps saying. So he says, Putin's whole argument for his attack on the Ukraine is that NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is encircling Russia. Right, so let's look at that. And I'm saying Russia now, not the Soviet, because the Soviet Union has fallen. When NATO was first created back in 1947, there were 12 states, the 12 Western states who were part of NATO. It then expanded. When in the late 1980s, 1989 to be precise, onwards into the early 1990s, the Warsaw Pact, which were the countries which, after the Second World War, the Soviet Union had taken, as I said, they rolled through the German armies and pushed them through, and basically instilled in all of those countries in the East communist states. So those communist states then became part of what they call the Warsaw Pact. So they were brother communists, if you will, to the Eastern Bloc. Now, some of them were probably brother communists because they believed in it, and others of those states were not, but were rolled over by the Soviet Union. And then what happened is puppet states were put in place by Stalin at the time. I'm not going to argue that some of these states didn't want communism, because some of them did and some of them didn't, and that I'll leave you to look for yourself. Like I say every week, look it up yourself, understand what I'm talking about, and look at your own assessments of what's gone on. So you've got the Warsaw Pact now. So these are non-Soviet states that were part of the communist world at the crossroads with the capitalist world in Europe, and that's where the Cold War battle was. It was cold in Europe, but it was not cold in many other parts of the world. Indeed, millions of people lost their lives in places like Vietnam, Congo, Angola, Mozambique. In South America, many people lost their lives. because the Cold War was being fought in many other places, because some of these countries either took on communism or were perceived to have taken on communism and therefore undermined, or took on capitalism and were perceived to take on capitalism or did take on capitalism. So that war was being fought by proxies all over the world. It was only a Cold War in the West because of the armaments agreements and the fact that if you attack one NATO country, you attack them all, and because of the nuclear umbrella for both states. So the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons subsequently after the United States. Obviously, the United States had the first nuclear weapons and showed the Soviet Union that it had them by dropping the nuclear bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And by the way, if we're going to talk about war crimes, which we're now speaking about, to drop nuclear weapons that kill 300,000, 500,000 people in one blast, surely those are what you can call war crimes. To the bombing campaigns that were carried out by particularly the United States and the UK during the Second World War, which some evenings cost the lives of 60,000 German citizens in one blow, mainly obviously women and children and some men, because the troops may well have been in barracks and not necessarily there. But the bombing campaigns were area bombing campaigns and not particularly against directed areas. 1,000 bombers dropping the bombs all at once. So Dresden firebomb example, which obliterated the whole area, or in Hamburg. If we're going to talk about war crimes, we're going to have to look at these and then say, were they not war crimes? And we could jump even further forward and talk about actions carried out by others, let's say Saudi Arabia in the Yemen, for which we are supporting them with aircraft and with targeting, or our actions in Iraq or in Afghanistan or whatever. So I'm only mentioning this because it's all about the context. When you listen to things, you need to actually understand where it all comes from. And I spent time in both Afghanistan and Iraq from the beginning of those wars to the end of them. Not Afghanistan, but Iraq, because I retired by the end of Afghanistan. But from the beginning of Iraq to the end of Iraq, I was there. So I'm telling you what the destruction was like and people being killed. So I digress from that because that was one of the questions. And the reason why I'm doing this, by the way, is because many people have asked me, and one of the questions was, is Putin going to be guilty of war crimes? Well, if he is, then so are we. So we've got to be pretty careful about how we're going to set that up. So you've now got this situation whereby you've got the Warsaw Pact and you've got NATO, 12 people. Now, at the end of the Cold War, what happens is we then move those from the Warsaw Pact. And as a general rule, most of those states get moved into the Western sphere of influence. So they come amongst us, and indeed, more so, they come into the EU and into NATO. So if you imagine, before the end of the Soviet Union, you had NATO, quite rightly, 12, and then extended to about 18, Turkey's brought in and various other states are brought in, to defend the West from communism. All of a sudden, with the fall of the Soviet Union and Russia now becoming capitalist, no longer being communist, it's now a capitalist state. A lot of people need to understand this. Russia is not communist. It's now capitalist and has been since 1991. So, and in fact, in 1991 to about 1997, till Putin came in, absolutely capitalist. Unrestricted capitalism, which is why you've got oligarchs, with people just rubbing the whole place red. So the situation is, NATO then expands and takes in most of those Warsaw Pact countries. So now you've got 30 countries, particularly the Baltic states, which also used to be Soviets within the Soviet Union. So 30 countries now sit around Russia. Well, who else are they looking at? I mean, what is the reason for NATO if we're not looking at defending against Russia? But if we're defending against Russia, why are we defending against Russia? Because it's no longer communist. So what's the raison d'etre for it? That's when you look at Putin and he says they want to destroy Russia. Forget whether it's communist, capitalist, Russia is the enemy. And that is what he can sell his people. And indeed has sold his people. Because his people look at that and they say, yeah, why is it that these 30 states, some of them 5,000 miles away, like Canada and the United States, because basically I think it's around about 78% of NATO is the United States, particularly of equipment. So heavy lift equipment like Military Airlift Command and stuff like that, AWACS, mainly most of that's American. So, and obviously most of the nuclear capacity would be American if it ever came to that. So you've got America now sitting on every border nigh on of what is now Russia and not the Soviet Union with its NATO power. And a revamped Russia, and Russia did revamp itself. You can imagine Soviet Union, one of the two superpowers, it was only really ever a superpower in terms of military superpower. It's now revamped its military capacity. Now people say, well, why is Russia revamping its military capacity? Let me give you one statistic which we should understand. The United States spends each year on its military round about $1 trillion. This is in open wealth. There's a lot of programs that are covert programs that are not spoken of, and they're in the hundreds of billions as well. So each year on open programs, the United States spends around about $1 trillion. Now, think about it. That amount of money being spent by the United States is more than the next 9 countries' expenditure below it put together. And those countries below it are China, Russia, the UK, France, Germany, Japan, Saudi Arabia. I can go on. Right? So all of those expenditure put together does not reach the expenditure of the United States. And the United States justifies this under the Monroe Doctrine by saying the United States has to be the world's number 1 superpower. Simple as. That's the doctrine. So how is it that that's allowable? But when Russia begins to up its military strength, perceiving 30 enemies on its borders, we say, why are they increasing their military power? So you've got to see this in context. This is all I'm trying to give you, is some context. I'm not saying, yeah, you're right, President Putin, you should invade the Ukraine. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is context. So, why the Ukraine? So now we come to it. One of the biggest problems I see, and I think I understand from that perspective, is the Ukraine, and I think Jack Straw was one of those who said we were going too far. The Ukraine wanted to become part of the European Union, and the European Union wanted the Ukraine to be an associate member and then maybe in the end at some stage become part of the European Union. If you are Russia, you see that as the final closure of encirclement in the West by NATO. Now, when the Ukraine then says it wants to join NATO as well, that doubles it. Because effectively, even if it's just within the European Union, they will effectively have Article 5 protection anyway. Article 5 is that says if you attack us, one of us, you attack all of us. Because I could not imagine somewhere a country attacking, like Russia, for example, attacking a EU country without the EU having to do something. So therefore, the EU's having to do something would be NATO, because that's the biggest connection that the EU's got. I know it wants to talk about forming the EU army, and indeed it may well form an EU army now that the UK is out, because the UK didn't want the EU to form a UK army when it was part of the European Union, for the simple reason that the UK is a major player in NATO and will be just part of the player within a big part player, don't get me wrong, but will be a part player in an EU army when it was part of the EU, because the Americans would not be present. That's the important factor. So an EU army means that the Americans are not present. It's the EU doing it all. So British foreign policy has always been, I should explain that, has always been to keep the United States in Europe. Indeed, that's why NATO was formed in the first place. NATO was formed in the very first place to keep the United States in Europe, to have that guarantee, the nuclear guarantee, and the power of the United States anyway. Its economic power, its military power. So to have that guarantee, so to keep the United States in Europe, NATO had to be kept. That was the first thing, and that's why it was created. And the United States was happy to create that, because at the time it was the only superpower, really. The Soviet Union was in absolute devastation, and the United States had zero devastation. So that's basically what it wanted. The second element of it was to keep Germany in check, suppressed. So NATO was there to keep Germany suppressed. There was a lot of NATO bases in Germany. It suppressed Germany and prevented Germany from going forward. And from our perspective, it was also to give us a power base within the continent of Europe, sitting on the continent of Europe. Indeed, a buffer to fight our wars in Europe rather than to fight them in the United Kingdom. So, and a United Kingdom that obviously was beginning to fracture in terms of empire. So, we had to look for somewhere else. Empire was beginning to wane. So that was the reason for NATO. So that's why many players wanted to keep NATO. Some people wanted to keep Germany down, French and others. Some players wanted to militarily. Economically, Germany's a powerhouse and, surpasses everybody else in Europe. But militarily, they didn't want that to happen. Coincidentally, this situation now is going to make Germany a military power again, I believe. Because the demands that we're saying that the Germans should take some action and sell weapons overseas and put soldiers on the ground more is going to bring Germany actually towards what people have been trying to prevent it being in the first place. The most major power in Europe, and that includes us, by the way. Not when I say Europe, I mean the whole of Europe. Germany by far will be the most major power. And that's what's going to be created by this situation. So I never thought that Putin, President Putin, let's be respectful, President Putin has been respectful to all leaders, that President Putin would have attacked the Ukraine. I realise that he couldn't allow the Ukraine to come into either NATO or into the European Union from his perspective. But I think what he's done is progressed both of them. Progressed both of those issues. I think it's very bad play from him. He will not be able to take those cities and control them. Look, he's not going all out. The reason why he has not taken those cities is because, frankly, he's fighting a war under very limited rules of engagement. They are not killing people willy-nilly. This is just propaganda. By the way, the first thing that happens in war, and I'm going to tell you this, is truth as all goes out the window. Right? So he is not going around bumping off civilians. His forces are not doing that. They've been clearly told not to do that. They're not bombing many areas. They're using artillery 9 times out of 10 rather than actually sending aircraft over. So there's a lot of things that are not happening, which they could do. They could, like they did in Chechnya, they could have bombed the place silly and taken over. But they're not trying to do that. They're not doing that. Because I think they realise that actually a brother Slav people, you want to keep them positive. And there are enough in the east of the Ukraine who are positive towards Russia because they are Russian speakers. They are Russians. They're ethnic Russians. And they're perceived that the Ukraine was preventing them speaking their languages. This is true. I've been in the Ukraine and I've been in Russia. And what I will say to you is true. There were the sons and daughters of those who were Ukraine patriots who came back to the Ukraine after it got its freedom, as it's perceived, from the Soviet Union, became independent. Those people came back and were beginning to run the country. And some of them, not all of them by any means, were basically extremists and didn't like the idea of people still speaking Russian, etc. And therefore, laws were being made in Donbass region. And it's true that one couldn't speak Russian and one would have to go and speak on all official circumstances. It would be the Ukrainian that one would speak. Now, in many countries, including Belgium, example, you can speak 3 languages and all of them are official. Or in India, you've got several languages that are official. And in South Africa, you've got about 5 languages that are official. So, and even in the United Kingdom, we have at least 2 languages that are official, probably even 3. Welsh being one of them, example, if you're in Wales. So you can accommodate that. There should be nothing stopping individuals from speaking a different language. It's silly to try and prevent that because it allows actually Russia to play a game. It allows the Russian state to turn around and say, well, listen, see what's happening with you? They're preventing you from even speaking your own language. And this is what some states do when they don't think their way through. Now, on this circumstance, President Putin hasn't thought his way through. He may, to my perspective, the only thing I could see him wanting to get out of this invasion would be to split the country into a third and 2/3. So the Russian speaker to be his and the rest of it to be to the west, but to act as a buffer so it would be to the west, but it wouldn't be part of either NATO or part of the EU. So he wanted the best of both worlds. I've got this buffer in the east, Donbass and beyond, going northwards and beyond. And I've got this, the western part being split off Yes, it's its own Ukraine, but I'm demanding that it doesn't join NATO or it doesn't become part of the European Union. And I think that's what his move was. I think that's all I can think, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense to me. It's a bad move, because I think if you've seen anything from what has happened in Iraq and what has happened in Afghanistan, and by the way, I'm not somebody who's, as the Germans would say, who's a Klugscheißer, somebody who came later on suggesting this. I wrote at the time when we invaded Afghanistan, and when we subsequently invaded, by the way, when I say we, the United Kingdom, we followed the Americans into Afghanistan and we followed the Americans into Iraq. Both times I wrote papers for the agencies where I was stating why we shouldn't do this, based on terrorism, but it could have been based on the whole of all other aspects, because I knew, yes, we would win the wars, both of them, very easily, because the United States is by far the most powerful military power in the world, by far. And there is zero chance of them losing the war-fighting area. What I did think is they would lose is, I thought they would lose holding on to the territory. And I was right on both occasions. Absolutely right. Because, you know, if you hold territory, you've got to be willing to die to keep it. And have your troops dying day after day after day in a war of attrition that basically isn't a war, it's been won, but you've now got to hold the ground that you've taken. And this would be the problem if he takes Kiev. You've got to hold it. How are you going to hold it? From people who are sniping at you, who are blowing you up here, blowing you up there. We call them insurgents. And if he took it over, he'd call them terrorists the same way we did. But, you know, the reality is that they're patriots, you could argue. Because if somebody took over Britain and we started fighting from behind the hedges or wherever, we'd say we were patriots. The same way as we said to the French are patriots. The Germans, they'd taken it over. Indeed, you could even go a step further when the Germans took over in the Second World War. They did a deal with Pétain, and France was no longer at war. It accepted that the war was over. But the Maquis and various other French units, French communists, exactly, who kept fighting, we see as patriots. The Germans just said they were terrorists, right? It's all in the terminology, folks. This is what happens in warfare. It's all in the terminology. So as far as the Germans are concerned, we've signed a peace treaty with France. The man who's in charge of France, de Gaulle says he's in charge, but he isn't. The man who's actually sitting in France and who's in charge of it, we've sat down in a railway carriage, the same carriage that they made us sign the First World War over in. We've sat down with him and we've signed it, and the French have said, yeah, we're no longer at war and you're in charge of these areas. And any Frenchman who continues to fight from there on after is a terrorist. And this would be exactly the same in the Ukraine. The Russians, if they took over, would say anybody who's still fighting is a terrorist, and we're fighting a terrorist war. But I'm saying, as we said about Iraqis, and as we said about Afghanis who fought us, because, you know, yes, there could have been Taliban. Yes, there could have been various other in Afghanistan, or various others in, and I could name you 10, 15 groups in Iraq. But at the end of the day, if they put themselves under this banner of we're fighting for our country, what can you do? Because that brings a lot of people in, brings a lot of insurgents into you. And you know, we can call them whatever we wish, terrorists or whatever. But for the people, you know, you use your brother, your sister, your auntie, your uncle. And believe me, we were doing bombings and actions in Iraq and Afghanistan that were killing a lot of civilian people. Let's face it, over 100,000 people have died in Afghanistan. Some people say 300,000. I don't know the exact figures, and I'm sure that the United States has the actual war figures that are lined up. But the bottom line is that's a lot of brothers, sisters, aunties, uncles who hate the West based on that. And that's what I wrote the papers before any attack. And this is what I would have said to Putin if I were a Russian. I'd have said, listen, you go into this, you're going to cause a whole load of people their death, and they're going to hate you. They're going to hate Russia, and they're going to fight you. We may defeat them in the initial war fighting phase, but we will not defeat them in the insurgency stage that follows. So I think I've given you my view about where we are. A lot of propaganda is going around. Yes, it is. It's a poor decision from Putin. He is going easy up to now. Whether he continues to go easy is questionable, because when people start saying, oh, Russians can't beat one country, it may be that then spurs him on to be more devastating in his actions and to unleash, you know, a proper shock and awe, because he hasn't done that yet. So to unleash shock and awe, which is like we did in Iraq, so that could happen. Yes, the other question that I've been asked on this week is nuclear war. Right. Again, what's the advantage? Why would Russia involve itself in a nuclear war? But that said, the problem is with organisations and countries. When a war starts, nobody ever knows where it can end. And the question of how Russia is being perceived and what it's doing and how we are degrading Russia now economically and hoping that the Ukrainians will degrade Russia militarily can only be perceived in Russia as an act of war from our perspective, from our side against it. So NATO and the West against it. Now, does that lead it to make silly decisions that then move it along the nuclear route? Particularly if something happens like some stupid statement people were talking about, putting a no-fly zone up. So you're going to have NATO aircraft against Russian aircraft. And before you do, you've got big problems. Because as soon as one gets shot down, what does either side do? Either side has to show that it was not hit for no reason. That's why, by the way, I should inform you, personal protection of ministers and prime ministers, which I've been doing, is of the utmost importance. If you lose a prime minister in particular, or a president, or the head of your country, and you lose him to assassination, and it is aligned to another country, oftentimes you are orientated then to take action against that country, which could lead to all-out warfare and many thousands, if not millions of people dying, depending on what the capacity of the countries that are involved in that battle. So when these things start, when these things happen, nobody knows where the limits are of them. And for you to assume that you can start them and if they just finish in a moment's notice is cloud cuckoo land. That is why the only actions that need to be taken now are actions of cool heads, are actions that say, let's get a political process going to try and end this conflict. By the way, I will say one other thing. The First World War was started by what's known as a Blankoscheck in German, a blank check in English. And it's because what happened is the Germans gave a blank check to basically allowed another country to bring it into warfare and allowed another country to do something that because it was in allegiance with that other country, the Germans had to follow on. I'm not going to go into the whole history of it, but the bottom line is oftentimes that's what happens. You give somebody else so much power over you that you have to take actions because of what you've given to the other country. So let's take Vietnam and the Americans giving power to the Vietnamese in the South, Vietnamese capitalists, where they were taking actions that led them into a greater war against the Northerners. And this is where problems can be aligned. So we've got to understand the way the Ukraine functions. A few years back, and I'll end on this just to give you an understanding of the Ukraine. A few years back, what happened is that a journalist was shot on the doorstep of his flat. His wife came out, saw him laid down, blood all coming out of him. He'd been shot. Our now Prime Minister, who was then Foreign Secretary, instead of waiting to see what the circumstance was, got up in the House of Parliament and said, Russia is dastardly, it's outrageous, it's shot a journalist, killed him, his wife is screaming and shouting, which she was, because as far as she was concerned, her husband shot dead on her doorstep, and it must be the nasty Russians who've done it. What happened was, it's what we call in the intelligence agency a false flag operation. The guy was not shot dead at all. In fact, what had happened is they did some Hollywood stuff on him. He lay down on the floor. The wife knew nothing about it. They then set blanks off. The wife comes to the door. Husband's dead on the floor. She screams, bloody hell, calls an ambulance. He's taken away, not dead at all, just been made to look as he's dead. And then he's dragged off. He then had second thoughts. He thought, hang on, if I'm meant to be dead, and the British Foreign Secretary has stood up in the House of Commons saying the nasty Russians have killed us and this is poor Ukraine, this is what's happening to us there. He said, right now I'm in absolute danger because I cannot now come back to my wife and tell her what's really happened, because if I do, the Ukraine looks silly and looks nasty and looks as though it's actually trying to cause war. And he thought to himself, hey, I'm a dead man here. He ran back to his wife and told him what had happened and put it on the news media because that's the only way he'd stay alive. And the news media then had to say it was a hoax. The Ukrainians have set it all up. So what I'm saying to you is be cautious about what you see and about what people say is actually happening. We call that psyops. Now, don't get me wrong, the Russians will be doing exactly the same in the other direction. But of course, we're aiding in those psyops now because we are supporting in every way we can, Ukraine, of a short of us actually going in. So what you're seeing on the news, and unfortunately our news media questions zero, they're just putting out information willy-nilly, which I would suggest a whole host of it is frankly fake, just the way this guy was when he was said to have died. So please be cautious of that, because when you start, we're tugging at the strings of people and people saying, oh, children dying. Well, let me tell you where children are dying. Children are dying in the Yemen every day. Children are dying in Somalia every day in those wars. And we're supporting one side or the other 9 times out of 10. Children were dying in Iraq. Children are dying and starving in Afghanistan. Children are dying in Mexico. I could go on and on and on. All of them to a greater degree than who are dying presently in the Ukraine. I'm not going to say the war isn't going to hot up and get more so, but presently. But we don't give a monkey's uncle about it. We say nothing. So again, I was asked about Russia, so I'm speaking about Russia. I can spin it around and speak about the Ukraine in the opposite direction and say Putin should never have, and I repeat, never have a veto whether the Ukraine joins the EU or joins NATO. However, and this is what I'm going to say, prudence is such that what we wouldn't say is the Chinese could put bases in Mexico, that the Americans wouldn't allow it. You see the Americans already today, example, saying North Korea is getting a nuclear weapon that's got IBM capability. Well, the United States has thousands. So is it wrong for Korea to have them as well? And I mean wrong to the level of course, it's tactically and strategically not advantageous for us for that to be the case. But is it wrong? You've got to open your minds. Is it wrong? The problem with what we've been doing over the last few years, particularly with what happened in Libya with Gaddafi, and I'll leave it on this, is Libya gave up its nuclear capacity or its potential to nuclear capacity. And what happened is that then we started, and I mean we, the West, that is the United Kingdom, France, and I could never understand how we were in it, but the French, Italians, started actions in Libya and supported the Syrian sections of Libya against Gaddafi. I can understand why the French did that, because they wanted the oil that was in that region. But we already had the oil deals with BP in the western areas of Libya. So what I'm saying is we started the actions. It happened. Then the United States came in and we bombed Libya. And Libya moved from the wealthiest country per capita in Africa to one of the poorest, where people are still killing each other en masse now to this very day. But what it did show is it meant that the whole region was destabilised. And areas which previously were not taken by Islamicist organisations have now become taken by Islamicist organisations because Gaddafi was keeping a lid on it, and also his weaponry has now gone out to these Islamicists. So as far down as Nigeria, you're seeing the problem happening because of what happened in Libya. So the law of unintended consequences, my friends, happen if we don't look at what we're doing. And unfortunately, intelligence agencies too often work to politicians who try to solve today's problem but don't think about what's happening tomorrow. And this is where we have to be cognizant of what we're doing, particularly in this theatre. So, as I say, yes, Ukraine should have the opportunity to join NATO. Ukraine should have the opportunity to be in the EU. But politicians have to think of the consequence of those two things happening for the rest of Europe and maybe further afield. I hope that has been of some interest to you. As I said, I've been asked by many to explain Russia's position, so that's why I spoke about Russia. I think the Ukrainian position is a little bit easier to explain insofar as it's defending itself. But I hope that you have some understanding. It's not some sort of madman perspective, albeit that I think it's a miscalculation and an incorrect perspective that is carried out. But I think you need to understand where Russia probably sits. And again, I can only surmise, knowing some of the history of the country, where Russia probably sits in terms of what it thinks it has to do to secure its border and to make sure it is safe and that it doesn't lose, again, the losses like it did in the past in World War II. It doesn't justify it, it just explains it. Thank you very much, ladies and gents, and I'll see you again next week.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
More than a quarter of a century, I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.